NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that you've joined us for today's discussion. It's going to be navigating system change from a community perspective. And so today's discussion is actually the third and final webinar in a series entitled Looking Forward, Modern Strategies for Prosecution and Defense. My name is Monica Reed. I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Advocacy for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. So this webinar series is actually presented by NACDL, and it's co-sponsored by the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, and is supported by a grant from DOJ's Bureau of Justice Assistance. I do want to point out, though, although BJA funding for this training, BJA is funding this webinar, they do not endorse, support, or review the content, so the views and information presented today do not necessarily reflect the positions of the DOJ. Today's conversation is going to focus on how you, as a community stakeholder, engaged citizen, voters, or however you choose to identify yourself, can stay engaged and keep your elected prosecutor accountable with a focus of those under the banner of progressive prosecutors. In recent years, we've seen more attention being given to the role and discretion of prosecutors. And so rather than simply working outside the system, many are turning to electing prosecutors that they believe will push progressive criminal justice policies and do less harm than their predecessors. So a little bit of housekeeping. We want to, if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. And then feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves, your organizations, and where you're from. We have 4 really dynamic speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them and let them further introduce themselves. Starting off, we have Carissa Hessick. She is a professor of law and associate dean for faculty development and the director of Prosecutors and Politics Project at UNC School of Law. We also have Stephanie Morales. She is the Commonwealth Attorney for Portsmouth, Virginia. We have Jamala Rogers, who will be joining us later. She is the executive director for the Organization for Black Struggle in Missouri. And we have Sarah Stout. She is the senior policy analyst and staff attorney for Chicago Appleseed. So I've asked each person in their kind of opening remarks and when they're further introducing themselves to include, 1, the role and powers of the prosecutor in their opinion, and their thoughts on what is a progressive prosecutor. And then we'll also allow them to further introduce themselves. So I want to start with Stephanie, and if you could, keeping those 2 questions in mind, Stephanie, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you became a Commonwealth Attorney in Portsmouth.
Thank you for having me. So I'm hearing like the Teddy Riley echo effect. I don't know where it's coming from, but just wanted to throw that out there. So, you know, first of all, I come to the space as an elected prosecutor, having the honor of serving in the city where I was born and raised. And, you know, before I identify as a prosecutor, I identify as a Black woman, a mother of 4, and a wife of a Black man in a society and in a system right now where we have had systemic and structural racism permeated throughout everything that we have experienced. So I have to first say that without acknowledging the systemic inequities that we've had, I don't even think we can have a realistic conversation about where we need to go. And so I lead from that space. I lead, you know, not again as somebody who identifies first as a prosecutor, but I identify first as a public servant. And all of the practices that I have been kind of structured around that thought process. So I've been elected since 2015. It's been about 5.5 years of consistently trying to first engage with the community and then also hold myself and law enforcement accountable. And so some of the programs that I've had have been centered around having youth be a part of the criminal legal system, trying to develop the future leaders of our system, ensure that the young people in our community are prepared for success. So we've had 200 mentees in the office, and then we've gone to the public schools consistently, myself and members of my team, to teach young people about the law and how that translates to their daily activities and their activities on social media. Also have a program called Control Alt Delete, where since 2015, I've been holding seminars in the community, and starting in 2016, started going into prisons to engage with those who are incarcerated, to discuss reentry, to discuss what they experience, to give them a voice, and to, again, serve people who traditionally prosecutors are not thought of as serving. But I see everybody, even those who are accused, even those who are incarcerated, as members of my community. And finally, talking about accountability, we are now at a time where our country, many of us are already, unfortunately, aware of everything that has been going on, but many are awakening to what has been happening in our criminal legal system regarding use of force and officers who are not protecting, but who are harming. And one of the things that I unfortunately had to deal with in 2015 was a young man in my community, William Chapman II, who was 18 years old, African-American young man, shot and killed by the police. I ended up investigating that case with the state police, making the decision to seek an indictment, indicting the officer, trying the case myself. And after a year of pretrial motions and a week-long jury trial, we ended up with a verdict of voluntary manslaughter. And that is not only because of the work that my office did, but because the members of my community showed up as jurors, and we had a jury that was representative of our community. And so I said that last because I think we also need to be, as a system, talking about what citizen and community member responsibility is. And it's not just voting, it extends to ensuring that we fight to make sure that we have juries that are representative of our community. So as you can see, I can go on forever. But it is, imperative that we speak in the reality of the fact that prosecutors have been at the forefront of the problem for so long. And we not only have a responsibility to correct the harms that have been done in the past, but to make sure that we are stopping harms from being perpetuated every single day when we go to work. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Stout now, if she can, keeping those two kind of questions in mind, but further introducing herself and then some of the work that Chicago Appleseed has been doing in Chicago and within the coalition around kind of keeping Kim Foxx accountable in her role as the Cook County State's Attorney.
Sure. So my name is Sarah Stout. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst and Staff Attorney at Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice. And basically what we do is everything court reform. We do judicial evaluations, we do various systemic reform efforts, we do legislative work, and most recently, now that we actually have a progressive prosecutor, we do work trying to both document the success that our prosecutor is having and hold her accountable to, the promises and campaign promises that she has committed to. So we do quarterly reports. We're fortunate enough to have probably the most transparent state's attorney in the country in terms of data access, who's been able to release 10 years of case level data. So we've taken the lead in the city in getting that data analyzed, which is not always easy, and sort of reporting what we find and showing the good, and when it's necessary, showing the bad, and trying to act as, truth tellers. Really, truth tellers when things are good and truth tellers when things could improve. But in a city where rhetoric about crime is usually about 90% BS coming from most corners, it's incredibly important, we think, to have people who are interested in backing up everything they say with data and research. In terms of what I think the role of a prosecutor is, and a progressive prosecutor, it's interesting. Stephanie and I were just talking before the call, and in my system, prosecutors essentially have almost all the power. I mean, really, if a prosecutor wanted to, they could just stop prosecuting whole swaths of cases with very little blowback except for electoral fallout, right? So that if they maintained their re-election, they really could do whatever they wanted. Now, the reality, of course, is very, very, very different, because the system will not allow that to go forward without making someone's job just impossible to do. But legally, our prosecutors have an immense amount of power. It's just interesting talking to Stephanie, and she's basically telling me that, our prosecutors, for example, can dismiss any case at any time and don't have to give a reason. Anytime during the case, they can say, we're nollie prosing. And, you know, other than the outrage of the public, they're not gonna, there's nothing a judge can do. And just talking to Stephanie and realizing that she doesn't have that power at all is wild to me. So I think it really varies. And I've realized more and more how important it is to understand jurisdiction by jurisdiction what actually prosecutors do. For me, a progressive prosecutor is any prosecutor who's committed to unraveling mass incarceration. Fundamentally, if you are not interested in reducing prison populations, reducing exposure to the criminal justice system, and recognizing that inherently the criminal justice system does harm to the people that are accused of crimes, and that harm has to be meted out only when absolutely necessary. That's what a progressive prosecutor is. I think that we're very early in the definition of that phrase, and everyone's going to have a different view.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So Ms. Rogers did join us. I want to give her a chance to also further introduce herself. She is Executive Director for the Organization for Black Struggle in Missouri. So Ms. Rogers, I asked everyone at the beginning to kind of, in their view, what's the role of the prosecutor, and specifically a progressive prosecutor? And then if you can answer those two questions and then further introduce your work as well.
Thank you. I'm Jamel Rogers with the Organization for Black Struggle. We have a long history in criminal justice issues, from mass incarceration to police violence. So for 40 years, we've been doing that work. And some of us who were founding members of OBS, like myself, actually did that in predecessor organizations. So for about 50 years, we've been doing this work. And so we know all the devils, and we know all the folks who are not doing what they're supposed to do. But it's a new day has dawned, and we're very happy about that. That didn't just come by happenstance. It's been a lot of mining in the fields to get us to where we are. And so I have to acknowledge that these folks are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're making changes. It's because they've been pressured from the outside to respond to that. Some of the things that the Organization for Black Struggle does, not in addition to following up on individual police brutality cases, we were part of the effort to bring local control of the St. Louis Police Department back to the citizens. St. Louis and Kansas City were the only two cities in the nation that did not control their own departments. It was controlled by the governor, and this goes all the way back to the Civil War. And in many cases, folks did not even know that. So we were able to successfully bring that home, and as a part of that, to establish an independent civilian oversight board. So that took some work, but along with that, if you educate people around one issue, it's easier to educate them around other issues. So when I think about the role of the prosecutor, most people think that that's what they do. They prosecute people for wrongdoing, and sometimes for right doing. I mean, they may not even have done the crime. And it's very easy, I think, for me to understand that, because when you go into a courtroom, the jury's white, the prosecutor's white, the judge is white, you make an assumption all of these people are working in cahoots and against me. And so it looks like it's all about just the prosecution. When really, and this was only a few years back when a progressive prosecutor told me, Jamala, the role of the prosecutor is actually to seek justice. And that was kind of a aha moment for me, because I too had bought into the things just about prosecution, and however many they can get racked up on their belt is what's going to propel them to win an election again and again off the backs of Black bodies. So I started to really think about that more and incorporate that into the way that we were looking at, since we're going to have prosecutors for a while, and even for those who believe in abolition, in the meantime, what are we going to do? And so I think for us, it really has been looking at how do you identify progressive circuit attorneys, in our case for the city, and the prosecutors in St. Louis County. And that took some doing, because again, everybody's so anti-prosecutor because all they see is my family had to do this and this is what happened to me, and there's nothing good that could come out of a prosecutor's office. And so we took a lot of time to actually vet the candidates who were going to be running. And I know that you had Wesley Bell in an earlier panel. He was one of the ones, he's one of the first African-American prosecutor in the county. And then we had the first African-American female, Kim Gardner, in the city. So those were very intentional acts. And because we knew that we had one opportunity to get it right with them, if we lost, it was going to take us back like decades. We really did work hard to make sure, A, that a platform came up out of the community that that they would agree to. And sometimes it was a perfect match. They already were thinking that way, that this is what they had to do. And so as a result of that, both of them won really big. I mean, people in the county was waiting for somebody like a Wesley Bell, just based on having like 20 some odd years of a Bob McCullough, who was had nothing to do with justice. So here we are, and part of the role for organizations like ours and other groups, including voters, is to hold folks accountable. So you said this is the platform you were going to run on. Let's see if you really run on that. In Wesley Bell's case, we actually did a 100-day progress report where we brought him to talk about what he had done and actually looked at that platform and asked him to speak to what he had done. And for the most part, he had done all that he said he was going to do in the first 100 days. So it's about accountability on both parts. I mean, he's accountable to the community and to what he said he's going to do, and we're going to be accountable to holding his feet to the fire. So, you know, some of the things that can't come up for us, for example, and it's now, I didn't know that this was happening, but about 3 years ago, we started a Black Jurors Matter campaign, because that is the place where a lot of this stuff starts to happen and send people on their way to the criminal justice system and incarceration. And that is now, Black people are being asked if they support Black Lives Matter. And if they do, they're being, kicked off the jury. So I see you shaking your head, Sarah, but this is, again, another obstacle that comes into our path that we have to pay attention to. And lastly, I just want to say that, and Stephanie may speak to this, but there is such vitriol around the Black female prosecutors. It's just unbelievable. I know it's coming out of a place of racism and patriarchy, but last year we actually had some of those Black prosecutors come to St. Louis to stand in support of Kim Gardner. And I mean, almost daily she's getting death threats. They're trying to almost revamp her powers as a prosecutor and divert some of her cases to the state attorney general. So all of these things are happening once Black people, progressive Black people, even progressive white people get into these offices. They see the game starts to change. They see people, particularly the Police Officers Association and the Fraternal Order of Police, like doing their influencing of what's going to happen. And so we've been very vigilant about how we're going to support the prosecutors, and then how we're going to continue to educate the general public about what's going on with those offices so that they stay informed and educated.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rogers. I want to kind of circle back before we get to Professor Hessick on something you said, of the importance of the pressure from the outside. And I don't know if Stephanie and Sarah want to kind of weigh in on that and just talk about the importance of that kind of community pressure on the prosecutors.
Yeah, so Jamala, I was there in St. Louis.
I thought you looked familiar.
Yeah, I had on red then too. That's one of the colors. So I will say this. I do see that there are some people, and Jamala said that, prosecutors are not going to do this out of the kindness or the goodness of their heart. And that's where I beg to differ, because if you don't have a heart for what's supposed to be happening with the community, if you don't see the members of the community as your family, and you rather spend your time trying to be friends with law enforcement or whoever else, then it's not the right job for you. I mean, yes, pressure should be applied. Yes, there will be times when the community does need to pull a coattail, But the reality is we should be in the trenches with the people. And if we don't see ourselves as being of the people and being a part of that community, we absolutely should not be there. Because the reality is you cannot change a heart or a mind of somebody who is a racist or somebody who wants to have the status quo or who is comfortable with things as they are and is comfortable with incremental change, which has gotten us into the position where we are now, which is not acceptable. It's getting people killed. And so right now, I make every effort to try to evaluate what my people and my community need. Because again, I'm a daughter of this city. This is where I was born and raised. These are where my friends are losing children to gun violence and things that are affecting me differently than people who look from the outside looking in like they're coming to clean something up, as instead of seeing this as something that's happening to them and the people of their community. And so, yes, in a situation where you don't have a prosecutor who feels that way, you absolutely must apply pressure. And if the pressure is not working, you need to get them out of office. But the reality is we should not settle for people who we have to constantly ride in order to get the results that we need. We need the people who have the right heart. We need the people who are of the people and who are going to make the right decisions, whether somebody is looking over their shoulder or not, because the potential for harm being done is too great. And I have the most beautiful people working for me, but I have to stay on them every day and remind them, you have a responsibility to go in the courtroom every single day and make the right decision by every single person. These are not files. These are not case numbers. These are people. These are community members. And so, yes, like absolutely, people should be checking folks. But we need the people there who are going to check themselves. It's called accountability. And unfortunately, we have had a system, not of justice, but a system of accountability, and for the members of our community who don't have a voice, but of no accountability for those who sit in my seat and who are members of law enforcement. And that cannot happen any longer. That won't do.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen is, I have a huge amount of respect for Kim Foxx. I think that she is one of the smartest people I've ever met. And also, absolutely, her heart is in the right place. And she has the lived experience. She grew up in Cabrini Green. She has the lived experience that is necessary to understand what's really going on in Chicago. The reality we've had to deal with recently as progressives is that she almost lost her primary because the strength of the racist attacks against her is so intense. We had a full-on FOP, Fraternal Order of Police backed, Trump supporter funded white man running against her it was the racial attacks. They're not, and this is true of so many things with the Fraternal Order of Police now, but they're not even trying to hide it anymore. It is so incredibly targeted and so personal. I don't even want to know how many death threats she's gotten. And, her day-to-day life is just incredibly, frankly, dangerous in a way that I'm sure was not in the plan when she decided to be a lawyer. And the real horror of that, at least for me, when as a person who's involved in the legal system, is some of that is coming from inside the house. She's got people who think that in her own office. And I was a defense attorney in the changeover when she took office, and I heard her own prosecutors say, I don't think it's right that we have a prosecutor who looks more like them than looks like us. And just says that, in a courtroom. And and those are people who are in her office. So her job is so immensely difficult. And she really, and from a political perspective, she has to be very careful to avoid so that we don't lose all of this progress. So the balance is incredibly hard, because the other reality, of course, is that doesn't mean that nothing can change, right? And as people who helped her get elected, and as people who, want to be her partners going forward, that also means that when, we're now in Chicago, everyone's a Democrat, so we pretty much consider her to be in her second term now. Technically, she has to get through an election in November, but that's kind of not a thing in Chicago. So we, we're now in a second term. We've survived a very hard primary, and it becomes, okay, so what needs to change? And I think finding that balance between the full-throated support that we want to give her, and certainly as much defense as we can against these just disgusting racist attacks, where can we also help her? Frankly, this is how I see it, help her figure out what are what are the least controversial, most effective things that you can do to change the system so that you don't get blown up in the paper, but we can get this done? And that's a lot of, as an analyst, that's all I'm trying to, like, that's a lot of what I'm trying to find, is the stuff where we can start fixing this system without hitting some of those political third rails that she can't hit it. And I'm never going to be not aware of that either. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for her political position, as well as, how much her heart really is with people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. So in Chicago, it's a hard balance.
So Sarah, we're getting ready to do that too. And that's our angst, that these folks like in the FOP have been working quite frankly, with the mainstream media to muddy her up going into the election. We have an election in 3 weeks. And so there is a bit of nervousness about that. Not that people don't support her, but we got COVID going on. We got lots of confusion about the mail-in vote. I mean, lots of obstacles. And so, it's not a nail biter yet, but what you are experiencing, I think we're going to go through the same thing and hope we come out okay on the end. But we know this one is a big one for us, even bigger than the first one, because now they've seen what she's about and what she's willing to do. And they're like, oh no, this we got to stop her.
Right.
I want to bring in Kristen to the conversation. She is a professor of law at UNC School of Law, and she's also the director of the Prosecutors and Politics Project. So I want her to kind of explain to us what that project is.
Thanks, Monica. I appreciate it. And I'm excited to talk to everyone today. I want to tell you a bit about the research that we're doing in the Prosecutors and Politics Project. But before I do that, I just want to say a couple of words about why I started studying prosecutors and politics. So when I became a law professor, I did so because I wanted to study criminal sentencing. And at the time, just a little while ago, that was a very hot and exciting topic because the US Supreme Court had just decided Blakely and Booker, which gave a lot of discretion back to judges to make decisions about sentencing. But as the years went on and I studied sentencing more and more, it became clear to me that at least in some jurisdictions and in some cases, decisions being made by prosecutors had more of an effect on defendants' sentences than any decision a judge could make in the sentencing proceeding itself. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the charges that prosecutors decided to bring and the plea bargains that they decided to give to defendants sometimes really constrained judges and had a bigger effect on a defendant's sentence than any decision a judge could make. So because of that, I started looking into the charging and bargaining power of prosecutors. And I was really surprised to find that, at least as a constitutional matter, there was very, very little that constrained those decisions. Now, as Sarah mentioned before, and as Stephanie talked to us about earlier before the panel, there can be local custom, there can be state law, but as a constitutional matter, the US Supreme Court, and then also as a matter of state law, many state Supreme Courts have said they won't review prosecutor decisions about charging, they won't review prosecutor decisions about bargaining, as long as the prosecutor had probable cause to support the charges and didn't make any decisions based on race, religion, or some other discriminatory reason. That power was solely entrusted to the prosecutor. And one reason the court said this was because prosecutors are democratically accountable. Now, in the federal system, that democratic accountability is sort of indirect, right? It's folks are appointed and confirmed by elected officials, and if the elected officials don't like what they're doing, they can remove them. We just saw that in the Southern District of New York. In the state system, though, the democratic accountability looks a lot more like just democracy, right? So state AGs, local prosecutors are largely elected through direct elections, right? 45 states elect their local prosecutors. So I wanted to learn more about democracy as a check on prosecutorial power, because the theory is, right, if you don't like what your prosecutor is doing, then you vote that person out of office. So that's sort of one of the things that we study at the Prosecutors in Politics Project. We study prosecutor elections. That was our first big project. We gathered information from elections in every single jurisdiction that elects a local prosecutor. You know, who were the candidates who ran? You know, were they Republican or Democrat, incumbent or challenger or open seat? Who won, who lost, what was the vote margin? All of these sorts of things. And that was our first big study, and we published a report on that earlier this year. Surprisingly difficult to get that information. The next big project we tackled was a campaign finance project, where we took that database of candidates that we'd created and sought their campaign contribution records. And we're hoping to have a report out on that in the next month or two. Because as someone just mentioned, right? I mean, there can be a lot of spending in these campaigns by interest groups to try to pick a particular person. One of the projects we're doing right now is actually not about prosecutor elections, it's about prosecutors as political actors and the political power that they have in state legislatures. So we've found that in some states, at least, prosecutors are very effective lobbyists, that they manage to get a lot of legislation that they endorse passed. They manage to block a lot of legislation that they oppose, and they manage to get a lot of amendments made to legislation to better fit their interests. So that's another big project we're working on. And then we have some other projects in the pipeline as well. A project on media coverage of prosecutor elections to look at what that coverage actually looks like. A project about trying to figure out the extent to which an elected prosecutor's policy choices reflect the policy preferences of their voters. So we're going to do some interviews and some surveys to try to figure out that fits. So I mention all of these projects because those projects have really influenced how I view the democratic accountability of prosecutors. And I have to say that my view is somewhat pessimistic. It's a view that it's that the democratic accountability actually isn't all that effective, all things considered. For example, in our elections study, we found that the majority of prosecutors, the vast majority of prosecutors, 70% of prosecutors ran unopposed for their office. In neither the primary nor the general election did they ever face a challenger. In our pilot study of media coverage of prosecutor elections, we found that many prosecutor elections don't get the sort of substantive coverage that you would need for voters to understand what the policies are of the different candidates and what their priorities are. And I should add, even more horrifying, we found many prosecutors who were not mentioned at all in the news in the months leading up to their election. So you couldn't find out anything about the prosecutor by trying to read the local paper. We also, I have to say, have just seen what I think of as a failure in transparency. A lot of states exempt prosecutors, especially when it comes to charging and bargaining decisions. It exempts those decisions from state sunshine laws. So folks can't seek information about case level data often by filing freedom of information requests that they could file for other types of government agencies. And even when there is a state law that entitles people to information, we've sometimes found that those laws aren't followed very well. So in our campaign finance study, even though every single state has a law on the books that requires candidates to keep track of this information and to file it either with the state or local governments, we found many local governments who either didn't collect or didn't retain this data, which, if you know anything about campaign finance law, basically what the Supreme Court has left a lot of places is just transparency as a way to try to inform voters when it comes to campaign contributions. Not possible because the governments didn't even keep track of this information. So I say this because as someone who wants democratic accountability to fill the void left by judicial review, I think we'd need to see systemic change in order for that to happen. I think it's possible for some of that change to come from grassroots organizations, or at least for grassroots organizations to fill the void until and unless the system itself is changed. So I think grassroots organizations can go out and recruit candidates to run, right? This is what Jamala was talking about in Missouri, right? That they can go out and try to convince people to run as prosecutors so that you have fewer unopposed elections and actually give voters a choice. I think grassroots organizations can host forums and otherwise help the media understand the sorts of questions that they should be asking and the sorts of stories that they should be running in the weeks and months leading up to a prosecutor election, so that you have voters who are genuinely informed about the sorts of issues that would matter, as opposed to just reading one or two stories about aberrational cases that may or may not swing voters. And I think that grassroots organizations can also help when it comes to transparency. I think we see in some of these big areas where it's maybe not so clear how good of a job the elected prosecutors have been able to do in changing policies within their own offices. We see court watchers show up and keep track of whether line career prosecutors are following the policies that their elected prosecutors said that they're going to institute in their office. Now, I say all of this, but I'm concerned about whether grassroots organizations are, at the end of the day, an answer for this. Because I think grassroots organizations already exist and are likely to be created in larger urban jurisdictions. And frankly, I have to say, I don't think it's a surprise. I don't think we should be surprised that where we've seen contested elections, where we've seen reform prosecutors come into office, where we've seen reform prosecutors decide to hand over 10 years of case level data. It's in these big urban areas where they have these grassroots organizations to contend with. But if the goal of prosecutorial elections and electing progressive prosecutors is to reverse the trend of mass incarceration, it's not enough to focus on urban races. The data that we looked at showed that it was the smaller rural jurisdictions, the places where people were the least likely to have a contested election. Those places are the places where incarceration rates are continuing to rise. Even before the sort of 2015, 2016 sort of class of more progressive prosecutors started to take office, we saw a downward trend in incarcerations in large urban areas. I would say not enough of a trend, or not a steep enough downslope. But in those rural areas, the rates are continuing to climb. And I just don't know that anything other than systemic change, rather than relying on committed grassroots activists, is going to be able to accomplish that change.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I want to kind of open it up and get other panelists' thoughts. There's a couple of nuggets that you said I wanted to kind of bring up. One, I wanted to see if the other panelists kind of shared your more pessimistic view of the effectiveness of the democratic accountability. I think one of the, with this webinar, one of the thoughts is how to hold, those who are running under this progressive platform accountable to their campaign promises, right? So you're saying you're going to do things a little differently, and we want to make sure that we're holding you accountable. And so I wanted to get one to see if the other panelists share that more kind of pessimistic thought that you expressed, and to see if there are things that are being done that are holding the prosecutors accountable. So I'll open it up. I see Sarah's unmuted. So
sorry, I'm like horrible. I make like crazy faces, which are fine in meetings, and in Zoom is super obvious that I have something to say. I'm that kid, I'm sorry. But I will make the case. I completely understand what you're saying. I will make the case that in Illinois it's working. And the reason I'll make that case is because, first of all, it depends how big your urban area is, right? Certainly in Chicago, Kim Foxx has had a measurable effect on overall incarceration rates, because 1 out of every, I don't even remember what the number is. It's more than, man, I can't remember. Most of the people who go to IDOC are from Chicago, are Black people from Chicago, the Illinois Department of Corrections. But I also think on that larger level, the political power of a really talented politician who's also a prosecutor in the statewide conversation can be immensely powerful. I mean, Kim Foxx is a lot of things, but one of them is that she's incredibly charismatic and an excellent speaker. Her voice in Springfield has been a very interesting thing to see. She had to drop out of the Springfield conversation for almost like 2 years now because she was fighting a challenge from the right and there just wasn't political room for it. We're very excited to have her back now. But early on in her time in office, she went down and spoke on behalf of getting rid of money bail. So we were sitting there and we were doing a legislative hearing and we had basically a bunch of community activists, a bunch of, wonky analysts like me lining up and saying money bond is bad. And then the other panel was a bunch of prosecutors, and having her on our side, meaning that there were prosecutors on both sides of that conversation, changed everything. I mean, it was huge in terms of the way that conversation progressed. And what we're seeing now is activation against some of the tradition was that the urban prosecutors were the loudest voices and were often the most conservative voices because they had been elected for ages and ages on a tough on crime platform. When we now have a voice from Chicago, the loudest voice, who is absolutely opposed to what the rest of the prosecutors in the state are doing, we're finding that a lot more people, that some really terrible prosecutors are stepping forward and saying really terrible things and actually putting targets on their back in the suburbs where they are starting to get contested elections. And we're just starting to see that the ability for legislators to say, not all prosecutors agree on this. Just the ability of Kim Foxx to be like, well, I don't agree that we should raise sentences on this. And I don't agree that we should, continue to use money bond. It's been hugely valuable. And grassroots got her there. And grassroots has continued. And what we've been able to do is take that grassroots and start saying, okay, well, go to the collar counties. Who are the jerk prosecutors in the collar counties that drive us crazy? We can run people against them, right? It's a good moment for it. I think in terms of the accountability to your campaign promises, we're never going to, it's going to be a long time till we have electoral accountability for progressive prosecutors from the left, right? And I don't need it particularly, luckily. But I can't, it's not like a grassroots organization is going to be able to run a challenger from the left against Kim Foxx, but that's not going to happen. That doesn't mean though that we can't, say things, when we need to, those grassroots voices, and this is where we find sometimes we're playing with fire. Critiquing Kim Foxx is something that our papers like to do. We have learned that actually they don't care that much what the critique is, which means they're willing to print stuff that we put in, which is sometimes playing with fire and not something we want to do, right? Because during her whole election, I had no interest in talking about the ongoing problems she has line prosecutors who just will not play ball. And it's a huge problem, and one that eventually she's going to have to, address in a really aggressive way. But I don't need to put that story in the Trib while she's running against a Trump-funded idiot, right? So I think that those grassroots, stories, especially in a world where we're taking to the streets, are starting to be very potent messages. So I have hope. I do. But it will require some of what we're doing, which is to try and get those urban grassroots organizations to start engaging on the state level and actually moving through the state. So
I'll just say really quickly, it's not clear to me that will happen. I mean, I haven't done a comprehensive look at the Illinois counties in the 2020 elections, but there are many, many counties.
Oh no, we don't have them for this time. I will be the first to tell you, we do not have them for 2020.
With uncontested elections.
Yes.
So it's not even just a question of whether there's been enough of a movement to try to convince the people in those jurisdictions that they should vote for someone else. They literally don't have a choice.
Yeah, but I mean, my thing would be, we are early days. I mean, and I think that there's really, wait for 2024. I'm serious. It takes time for these issues to move, but I think that there is, the momentum that Kim and the excitement that Kim has been able to build throughout the state for a different way of doing things has been fantastic. And I think that, 4 years is probably pretty quick to expect grassroots organizations to be able to move statewide. But I mean, we're coming, we're trying. I'm interested actually if Jamala is doing the same in Missouri.
I'm optimistic, but I'm also a realist. I don't know, because one of the things that I alluded to earlier is, as somebody like the Kim Gardner pushes the envelope, still within the confines of the law, she's getting the smackdown. And so then that makes it very difficult for people to have any faith in the system. So for example, in her public integrity unit, she's got some cases. One of them is a very high profile case of Lamar Johnson. In fact, he will be acknowledging the 25th anniversary of his incarceration for a crime he didn't commit. So as she started to move that, looked at it and say, I recommend that, hey, either gets a new trial or we release him. All of a sudden, she doesn't have the authority to do that. But before, I mean, folks were doing this kind of stuff. So it seems like the game changes, and I think people are going to get weary of that, because you fight for this reform and then nothing happens, and then you fight for that, nothing happens. So I get that the whole system has to be reformed and has to be clarified, and people have to understand what the role of the prosecutor is, not the stuff on TV, but what they really can do. Is going to make it real. The other thing I see happening, just based on the Black Lives Matter movement of right now, is it's going to be difficult in urban areas to run a white person against a sitting Black prosecutor. So now you're going to see other Black folks being put up to run against progressive Black prosecutors, which in some cases may make it more difficult to distinguish, because like you said, oh, it's two Black candidates. Well, obviously one's politics is probably going to be very different from the other one. And so again, that's the kind of education that needs to be done with voters and residents about, how do you distinguish it? Who's got a long-term or a long game plan of how they're going to reform that office while they're there. In St. Louis, people have been able to hold that office forever. It's almost like it's one of those jobs for life, even though they have to run in 4 years. And that's because, similar to what people have said, it's very difficult to run a citywide election against an incumbent. And so even if for the few people who have run up against these people, they've lost. And so to put somebody there based on the conditions and win was a big plus. But now we got to do something bigger and better and different if we want to hold on to what we've already got in there. So that is a grassroots movement to do that.
I want to kind of touch on really quickly something else that Krista said, and it was like the role of prosecutors as advocates. And I want to kind of initially direct this to Stephanie, because I know she's in Virginia, and full disclosure, I'm also in Virginia, so I'm in Northern Virginia. And we've seen kind of, I want to say a wave, but for us, the five main Northern Virginia counties have all elected progressive prosecutors under that banner. And working in the state legislature for a number of years, the State Commonwealth Attorney Association is very influential, and they're very present in the General Assembly and kind of weighing in on bills that are criminal reform related. So I want to direct this to Stephanie, because I know was not even in the first wave, she was in that early kind of movement, I guess you can say, in terms of progressive prosecutors. And if she can just share her thoughts on prosecutors as advocates and what she's kind of seen, if she's seen any changes in Virginia with the addition of more progressive prosecutors.
Yeah, so there's definitely been a shift because there's just strength in numbers, to be frank. And we also have this relationship with each other where we try to push each other to do things that we don't want to do. So like for me, for example, I'm a good executive office holder because I'm not trying to collaborate with people who are intentionally trying to oppress people. If you feel like as a prosecutor that you're not going to make it in life if you can't lock people up, I don't want to talk to you. I don't feel like talking to you because that's who you are. And anything that I say to you, none of that is going to change who you are as a person. And so some of the new group that's with, specifically Parissa, is one of the people who has been able to convince me, hey, come to the meetings, I just got here. If I say it, they're going to say, you don't know what you're talking about, but you've been doing this for 5 years plus, and you've been able to get, accountability for policing. You've been able to do these things. When you say it, they can't say that to you. They at least have to listen. And so they're, just being real with you, there has been a shift because some of us who have just like for me, I've been in the trenches. I'm like, I don't have time to play with you. I'm not going to play with you. I know what you're about. I'm in the trenches doing what I need to do for my community. So yes, there has been a change. We've been willing to have, conversations internally, and we've had meetings with members of the legislature as a unit, where we'll say, look, we don't represent the whole organization, but, between all of us, we represent a significant a significant group of the population of Virginia. And at times, depending on who's in unison with us, sometimes we represent the majority of the population in Virginia. And so there has been change there. I think prosecutors absolutely have to be advocates for what they think is right, because the other end has been advocating all this time, as you said, to keep the status quo intact. And so that is one thing I've had to become more comfortable with, is advocating outside of my community to the people who have the ability to create change. And then sometimes that advocacy has to happen through action. You have to take the lumps. You have to step out there and do things that you think are right. So for example, with that marijuana decision, we hadn't been, prosecuting marijuanas in the traditional sense for a long time, just because there had been struggles with the lab, and it wasn't, we're not going to go out of our way and break our necks to prosecute these cases when we need to concentrate on these murder cases, on police accountability, and all types of other things. But it was also the right thing to do, to take a stand and say, I'm not prosecuting marijuana cases because this is the right thing to do. Joined up with the public defender, all these wonderful things, and then just had issues because other people decided to weigh in because they didn't like it. They didn't want the reform. They didn't. But then now in Virginia, we have decriminalization, which is one step in the right direction. I hope expungement of records will follow. I hope all different types of things will follow. And I've made my position known. But I have to believe that putting myself out there, taking that risk, doing what's right, even if it comes at a cost, that does play into the advocacy role, because the members of the legislature are watching. They can see when members of the community embrace something, and then they have a desire to do something great too. Whether it's for the right reasons or not, we will never know. But I will always be there to push the envelope, again, for transformational change, because the incremental change is not it. It's not working.
Yeah, anyone else can, if they have any thoughts on the role of prosecutors as advocates, definitely feel free to weigh in.
Quick question for Stephanie. Stephanie, the Commonwealth Attorney Association, is it, if you don't mind me asking, when you guys decide to take a position on a piece of legislation, is it one office, one vote?
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, I've seen some interesting things where I've seen multiple people present from a certain office, but that is my understanding, that it's supposed to be the vote of the elected office holder. And then whoever the representative is at General Assembly is supposed to represent what the group came up with. Now, whether that's happening or not, again, I don't know, because in Portsmouth, Virginia, I just have not had time to go to Richmond and do the legislative watch where I'm there every day. I just can't do that. I don't have a desire to do that. I got things that I need to do. No knock to anybody else who can do that, but I don't know what's happening. And so that, again, we're trying to think around ways to make sure that we advocate and we make our position clear. And, even if that is not something that's done as in the official capacity with the state organization, we still make clear, hey, this is what we think needs to happen. And again, as Monica brought up, it has been monumental to have the other people who have come along who are, I've heard also the term decarceral prosecutors. And I kind of like that more than progressive. Because progressive has been taken and dragged all around to where we don't even know what it means anymore. So I like decarceral a little better. And so that wave has been amazing, because nobody was talking about progressive anything in 2015. Nobody was talking about reform. I got called a social worker. I thought it was cute. I was like, okay, great. Whatever you want to call it, I'm still going to come and do all these programs that I feel like my community needs, because it's been neglected for far too long. So that's a really good point. I know what's supposed to be happening, whether that in practice is happening. we'll soon find out, because I do think some of my colleagues will have some more time and who are closer to Richmond and can go and do some of those things. We'll be looking into those issues.
Awesome. Stephanie,
And I would just say, I know that, and I'm going to have to leave shortly, but to that point, I think that Kim Gardner would love to do that kind of advocacy on the state level. It's a element that she's comfortable in. She was a state representative before she took this office, so she knows how to do that. But I think, like you, Stephanie, her thing is like, I need to be laser focused on what I'm doing in this office. I don't have time for all that schmoozing and lobbying stuff. But I think, you know, based on what Carissa's saying, it's got some impact. But I just think that this first year, she had to double down on what she can get done and to protect her flank, quite frankly, so that she can live another day to fight. But certainly I see how beneficial that could be to have somebody in that role come down. The governor here just passed a huge crime bill that has all kind of ugly stuff in it. And, you know, if the prosecutors had come together and say, hey, wait a minute, or other folks, but, you know, it didn't happen the way that it needed to happen. So I think people have to do what they can do, not just legally, but what can they do humanly. It is also an issue here at play, particularly for the Black women that have been under attack every day that they've been in office.
Stephanie, I want to just quickly, if I can direct a question to Stephanie that came in through the chat. And so someone asked if you, I'm assuming directed to you, or if you're reaching out to other prosecutor offices to see if they're willing to do some of the programs that you've expressed today and yesterday in terms of the programs that you're doing for your community.
So that's the way it's phrased. First, you know, I don't call anybody and try to tell them what they should do, because I don't want other electeds calling me, telling me what I should do either. One thing that I do recommend, though, is I do recommend ceding power to those who don't have a voice. And so I have spent some time with one of my dear friends now. His name is Daryl, and he was incarcerated when I first went to the prison in 2016. He's now out. He's been out for over a year. And when he came home, I ran into him at an event he was having for the community. And I talked to him at a different event later on, and he told me some things he wanted to do. And I was like, look, whatever you want to do, I got your back. And since then, I've been supporting him at whatever he has going on. And I've also been showing up in places with him, like our reentry council, and like, you know, making sure that he has the floor so that he can speak to his experiences about being incarcerated and what that actually does to him and to families. And so while I don't, you know, I'm an open book as far as assisting anybody who would like to put the programs in place. I'll give you, you know, all the information. One thing that I do put pressure on and shame people or do whatever is we have this voice. We talk all the time. You know, we feel so great. We want to pat ourselves on the back about all these things. But when it comes down to it, do we ever cede our power to anybody else? Do we ever cede our power to those members of the community who do not have a voice and will not be heard if we don't make sure that they do? And so that's one thing that I'm absolutely down to share anything with anybody. But the call to action for me is like, step back and bring somebody else to the table, so that the people who have the ability to create change and who have the power to make decisions will hear what is actually happening to people, and they will put measures in place to make sure that it's not just on whatever prosecutor or whatever judges, that we have legislation in place and policy in place to protect people from what's been, you know, from the travesties that have been happening for so long.
Yeah, and if I can just follow with what Stephanie said, because I think that she's highlighting something really important, which is, I think that even though I love the idea and the concept of directly elected prosecutors, I mean, I think there's a limit to what individual prosecutors can do, whether it's because, they're in a jurisdiction where police get to make the charging decisions, or because they're facing pushback from judges, or because, you know, you're a prosecutor in Orlando, Florida, who said she's not going to seek the death penalty anymore, and the governor took away all of your cases. Or, as we were hearing, you know, before, that the legislature in Missouri is trying to strip Kim Gardner of her powers, or what we saw in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania legislature stripping a lot of authority from Larry Krasner over gun cases. I mean, I'm a big fan of the local control model because I think that it is a truly democratic way to make these really important decisions. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are all of these other forces at work that when those democratic decisions don't seem to be sort of anti-crime, pro-law and order, all of a sudden they seem to assert themselves an awful lot more.
I wanted to, in these last kind of 30 minutes or so, kind of talk about some of the more tangible things that communities can do. And so I'm going to start with Sarah, because there was so much kind of research on what the coalitions in Chicago are doing, especially once Kim Foxx was elected. And I'm going to use a quote from one of your coalition members. So I found an article where Reverend Charles Strait was quoted, and he said, "Fixing a system that ravages Black and Brown communities takes more than just electing a prosecutor." And so community organizers have to build structures to hold candidates accountable and establish relationships. And so Sarah, if you can just talk about kind of the relationship building that you guys have done in Chicago, the kind of structures that you guys have established. I'm not sure if it was you or if Chris mentioned some of the court watching, but I understand that's going on in Chicago as well. You guys have released reports on Kim Foxx's progress. So if you can just kind of talk about those tangible structures that are in place in Chicago so that other viewers who are sitting in jurisdictions where, okay, we just have, we've elected a progressive prosecutor, we're excited, we're expecting change. How can they go about measuring the progress that's making, and how can they establish that relationship or keep the relationship with the prosecutor?
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky in that as organizations, and I think this was probably true a lot of places, we walked in to Kim Foxx's administration with those connections because I work for 501c3, but a lot of, my partners had been knocking doors for her for, a year and a half. I think that a lot of what there's two big things that I think communities, however, and advocates can do, hopefully, to help. The first is telling the positive story, even if it's hard to tell. One of the things that we knew from the beginning is Chicago is huge. And as a numbers person, knowing how, really how sick the prosecutor's office in Chicago is, how many decades and decades, which means people who have been in this prosecutor's office and keep to a very racist, very mass incarceration focused, message. And let's be clear, a Black woman walking into Chicago cannot do what Larry Krasner did and fire 17 deputies on the first day, right? Like that was not a political option for her, even though I certainly have my list of deputies that I would be interested in seeing leave from my days as a lawyer. But so we knew it was going to take forever to actually see this change. And it's true. She was elected in 26. She took office, and even with the robust data that she's been releasing, we couldn't see a numerical change until last year, basically, until sort of mid 2019. And then we could, and it was cool. Like we can actually see now incarceration, sentences of incarceration are going down. The diversion programs are getting more diverse, on those big structural change levels. Whatever is going on in her giant shop is working. When we were in the middle part, though, we were getting a lot of, sort of questions, both as she, as a primary challenger appeared, but also from the left saying, well, what is she really doing? And we really tried to tell that story. For us, and you have to think about how that's going to work. And so for us, we asked people on the ground, okay, is this for real? Is there actually a change? Everyone we talked to who was a system player actually practicing in the courts said, yes, it's very, very different with the Kim Foxx administration. But I knew I wasn't going to be able to find it in the numbers because it's just, cases take time, right? It's just not going to be there. And so instead, we actually interviewed defense attorneys. We did a qualitative 35-person interviewing process of defense attorneys who had practiced under both administrations, who were able to say, this is what the change is. And I mean, to get into specifics, basically, the first thing she did, which is like not going to be written down anywhere. And sometimes you do have to sort of look for those things that aren't going to be in data, and they aren't going to be, only insiders are really going to know. Her predecessor had mandatory plea bargain asks, right? For her whole office. Here's the charge. You cannot agree to a plea deal unless, so any gun case, there must be incarceration. Any drug case above this level or with this many priors, you cannot agree to probation. And the first thing she did was just lift those and freed all of the prosecutors who did want to do good in her office to start taking mitigation packets and talking about and dismissing cases when that was necessary, and making creative decisions about how to prosecute in different cases. And so telling that story was key, I think, partially to getting our grassroots fired up again as we went into the election, of being like, oh no, she absolutely is the real deal. It's just, it's a big ship to turn. And I think so telling the good story is a huge thing that grassroots people need to do. The other is transparency and court watching and things like that. The narrative around our courts for as long as we've had a mass incarceration system has only been told by the tough on crime side, right? We have a police guy, he's anonymous on Twitter, who sits in bond court every day and tweets out, people's charges and what bond they get and how he thinks that that's ridiculous because they're horrible criminals. One of the things we're working on now is like, we should have someone in bond court tweeting out both, when good things happen, like stupid cases get dismissed. Like, for example, Kim Foxx is not going to prosecute the 600 arrests for disorderly conduct that the Chicago police felt were important, felony disorderly conduct that the Chicago Police Department thought were important to make. Not all the 600 are, there are 600 disorderly conduct. Less of them are felonies, but many of them are felonies, and it's annoying. But she's not prosecuting those. We want that out there. And then we also want to hold the judges accountable, and if necessary, the lying state's attorneys, of like, what the hell are you doing putting a no bond hold on a friggin' 18-year-old who's never been arrested before? And court watching also gives you the quantitative data, if you need it, that you won't be able to get any other way because it's real time. There's just not going to be a way to aggregate it otherwise. It's time intensive. I would say one thing: if you want to do it, start now, because for us, I hate Zoom court, right? I don't know about other jurisdictions, but right now we're mostly not in the courtroom. But the one thing it is good for is that you can crowdsource court watching. And so we've been able to massively increase the number of volunteers we have court watching because they can watch on Zoom. And a huge number of them have now committed to continuing to court watch once it involves going to 26th Street, right? Because I find that once people actually see what a criminal courtroom is like and how crazy they are, they sort of get hooked on the process of fixing them, at least in Cook County. So, that ability we have to tell the story of what goes on in our courtrooms every day. And that is something, and the prosecutors have had the platform to tell that story forever because they can talk about whatever case they want that they're prosecuting. Defense attorneys sometimes have it, but mostly don't. Mostly, at least when I was, if you're defending Roger Stone, yeah, sure, you can say whatever you want. I defended exclusively black boys and young men under 25 from North Lawndale, most of whom were charged with gun cases. There was pretty much no world in which speaking to the press about their cases was going to help them in the long run, right? I mean, it just wasn't true. And so if community groups can step into the gap, because the defense bar is not going to be able to do that, and tell those stories and elevate those stories of this is what it's like to actually go through the system, it's hugely valuable. So I think those are the two things that I focus a lot on. There's so much going on in every jurisdiction, but I think that you can't go wrong with telling good stories and watching what the heck happens every day.
Yeah, I want to let Stephanie and Kristen weigh in if they have any thoughts, but and also just get Stephanie in terms of how you have seen or managed kind of community expectations around your role and what you can do. I know like pre-webinar, we were kind of chatting a little bit of some of the restrictions in Virginia that may not be apparent in other states in terms of prosecutors. So if you want to kind of share that a little bit, or just how you kind of go about managing your community's expectations.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've really worked to do is to, one, develop that relationship. I mean, that can't be understated, because for so long, and I think it's been said before, prosecutors have intentionally flown under the radar. People not understanding the office, not understanding that it was an elected position and how it plays a role in the lives of members of the community. They benefited from members of the community not knowing who they are or what they do. And so for so long, that was the case. Nobody knew what was going on. So I've spent a lot of time trying to engage with people, whether they have a vote or not, young people who are incarcerated or who have felony convictions. I'm not just servicing the people who, quote unquote, are the voters, but, really engaging with the members of community about what this office does, what it means for them to actually participate and play an active role in the jury process. But again, that education piece is critical. People don't realize that the police officers are not under the Commonwealth Attorney. They do not report to me. I do not tell them what to do. They don't understand the magistrate system, that the office does not have a charging unit, that we are not initiating cases, and that by the time we get cases, there is already a charging instrument that has come from a magistrate with a police or member of the community swearing out probable cause. And then we get the case after it's already gone before a judge, we get it at the time of arraignment. And so it's very peculiar. People don't understand that process. But then what I've also realized is that when you engage and when the community feels connected, I'm getting Facebook inboxes about, unjust convictions in the past. I'm getting Facebook inboxes sometimes from somebody who's charged with a crime. I'm getting Facebook inboxes from people and social media, people contacting me any way they know how, because they just know who I am, whether they fully understand the role and responsibility or not. So the number one thing is just to be present, and then again, I bring my whole self, who I am, to this equation. Like, I'm never going to be somebody who I'm not. I'm always going to be the daughter of Portsmouth. I'm always going to, do whatever I want to do as a mother, as a woman. And that ability to relate to the people in my community as somebody who's just like them, it really opens up the doors for communication. So, I started off doing what I thought the community needed, and I continue to adjust on a consistent basis and grow. That Control-Alt-Delete program, it started off in the community as seminars, but then I was like, man, people are not, I need to go inside. And luckily I had a guy who was a guard at one of those facilities who I went to high school with. And he asked me, would you come here? And I'm like, I absolutely want to come there. And that started that whole process because of the relationships. So, it's hard to identify and nail down what people are feeling or what's going on. But it's that's the approach that has to be taken. It's a moving target. We have to continue to keep doing different things to adjust until we start to see the change that we need to have. So, that's not the sexiest answer in the world. But the real answer, I think, is it's a commitment that requires a daily dedication to doing what's right. It has to be done in a way where you cannot get tired and you can't feel good about what you've done and pat yourself on the back and think you're awesome, and not realize that there is an ongoing responsibility to push everybody who has the ability to either do harm or to correct injustice.
Yeah, I think it may have been you. I'm reflecting on some of yesterday's discussions where you said that I think police and prosecutors don't have the trust of the community because they haven't earned it. Was that you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I thought so. So I appreciate you kind of sharing kind of the things that you're doing to earn the trust of your community, and kind of pulling Sarah and Carissa into the conversation. If there's something, Sarah, that Kim Fox has done that's particularly notable to earn the trust of community, definitely feel free to share. And Chris, if there's something that in general that you think prosecutors should do to kind of earn the trust of their community.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Stephanie said about prosecutors traditionally flying under the radar, because I appreciate that this is a panel about holding progressive prosecutors accountable, but I think, some people practice in jurisdictions without progressive prosecutors. And in addition to that, I think that, a lot of these reform prosecutors have seen the pushback that they have because they've been transparent, right? So when Rachel Rollins publishes her list of offenses that her office isn't going to charge, and the Boston Globe does a nutter, and then come to find out her policy is just really articulating and making uniform what her predecessor was doing. I think that there's something there that's really sort of distressing, that prosecutors have flown under the radar by being able to say things like, we make the best decision in individualized cases. It's all about individualized judgment. And they won't tell you what their policies are. Or by saying, in my office, we prioritize X, Y, and Z. And there's no recognition about what gets deprioritized when those decisions are made. And so it makes me wonder whether accountability and transparency works to the detriment of reform prosecutors if they're the only ones who are subject to it, right? If we aren't seeing media reports that say things like, what's your policy on this? And the local DA says, I don't have a policy. And people aren't like, why in God's name do you not have a policy? You have an office of 60 people and you're the one who's elected. Where is your freaking policy? It makes me think that this is an important discussion. We need to talk about how it is that we make sure that people who are elected do what they say they would do. But I also think it has to extend to those people who are on their fourth re-election, who were appointed in the second to last year of their predecessor's term, and they were the deputy, and they've run unopposed the whole time. Those people need to get these questions as well. And the idea that you don't have a policy isn't an acceptable answer. The idea that you talk about where you're going to be tough and not when you're going to divert is not an acceptable answer. I feel pretty strongly that democracy and accountability can't exist for some people and not for others, and that it can be a burden for certain groups if they're the only ones who are there. Because I agree very strongly with what Sarah said, right? The stories that get told that are reported often come from law enforcement themselves, and law enforcement's rare, unless you've run on a reform platform, you're not going to stand up and talk about the cases that you didn't charge. And so folks aren't going to learn about that, and they're not going to be able to understand who they're voting for without that information.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right that, it's one of the reasons why Kim Foxx's transparency is so remarkable, because it's a terrible idea. From a political perspective, I'm very appreciative of it. But, yes, absolutely. Being transparent puts a target on your back. Now, I do think that the benefit to it that we're finally getting to, again, we've had to wait. Now we can run Anita versus Kim comparisons and really show the difference in a way that I don't think any other jurisdiction can, really, because we have that case level data available. But yeah, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, in terms of transparency. And, the Chicago Police Department is, all police departments are really corrupt, but the Chicago Police Department sometimes really just feels like it's almost like a whole different world. They're never going to be transparent. They're never going to tell the truth. They are happy to lie directly into a camera. They will not be held accountable by the local media. So yeah, basically, and I try not to say the name Jussie Smollett in conversations about Kim Foxx because it's the stupidest darn thing, stupidest darn racist dog whistle crap.
You should have said that in your Dave Chappelle voice.
It drove me crazy. But look, she tried to be transparent on that, and it totally bit her. in a way that, like, okay, I'm a defense attorney. The deal he got, and I yelled this at reporters and they wouldn't report it. The deal he got is the exact same deal that everybody charged with disorderly conduct gets and has gotten for like 8 years, because no one cares about disorderly conduct. Come on. It's like a class, it's a low-level felony and he had no background. But, you can't tell that story. So yes, it's a problem. It's absolutely a double-edged sword. And I think that the best thing we can do is try and convince our progressive prosecutors not to respond to that by getting really paranoid and really, really close-lipped, which I think has happened a little bit during the election for Kim Fox's office, and I understand why. But we really do in the future, it's like, let us tell your good stories, because the bad story, if you're transparent, the bad stories are coming. So you have a whole set of supporters who want to tell those good stories. So give us what we need to do that. Give us the policy that says, it's interesting. She decided not to prosecute all these protesters, and which to me, I look at it as like, which was a pretty politically popular decision, but she's very nervous, I think, about those kinds of things. And so it came out through a leak, or actually through a FOIA request from a reporter. They FOIA'd her emails. And then the next day, she was sort of forced to, okay, yeah, I'll write it down in a policy. I'll write it down exactly what I put in the email. And she's gotten great coverage for it. And so I think that's hopefully an example of, sometimes give your people a chance to tell your story. We're here for you. But yes, no, transparency is absolutely a double-edged sword.
I want to turn quickly in the last few minutes. So I got an audience question, and it's kind of geared toward police unions, but I wanted to see what you guys' thoughts are. So the question is, what can community members do to limit the power of police unions?
Stephanie and I are both like,
I have no idea. I don't know what, I don't know aside from, so this is the interesting thing. I don't know. There's so many different setups for how police unions operate that I would have to say, depending on how the city government is structured and what those city councils or, commissions or whatever allow, there's always opportunity for members of the community to pressure elected officials, hold them accountable, and tell them what they expect. Mm-hmm. And so in the event that there is a setup that city government is responsible for police union power, that is an avenue to hold your elected officials accountable, to ensure that they are not allowing non-governmental bodies to have a say in the way government functions. And that's the major problem. When there is a non-government entity that is engaging in interfering with government business, that should not be happening. And so that's one thing I can't say for certain, because everything is so different everywhere. But that is one thing I can say, that you should be finding out from your county or your city government how that is structured. And if in fact your city government is permitting a non-governmental body to have a say in government function, they need to shut it down.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents.
We're trying. It seems like the policing conversation has moved forward so quickly in the past couple of weeks that it's sort of, we're as advocates in Chicago, we're scrambling, but we are looking at the FOP since it's a huge problem in Chicago. And I would say there's 2 big things that we're targeting. The first is go find your police union contract and read it and figure out what's in there. Because what we have had some success with is actually both, first of all, some of the provisions are just outrageous, and you can get press coverage on the sheer insanity of the level of protection that some of these unions have been able to negotiate in for crooked officers. The really wonky, sort of, when I mean wonky, I mean like nerdy sort of lawyery way to do it is we've challenged a couple of them on voidable for public policy grounds, and we actually won last week, which was huge. It was in their contract that they were going to destroy all misconduct records after 5 years. It's just there. And we got that voided for public policy. And that was a huge win, again, that gets that coverage. I think the other thing we can do, though, and this is also a way that we can support our black female prosecutors, is so many of these groups are hate groups, is the reality. They are white supremacist hate groups. And the people they are targeting can't say that out loud. And so the community needs to. I mean, I'm sorry, like, it's like, you can't, that's, and I want to be that voice. And I think that getting investigative reporters to do those Facebook dives and show what these people are really saying behind closed doors and reveal these, again, maybe some of you are lucky. Maybe some of you have police departments that aren't just giant white supremacy organizations. I don't. So certainly our FOP is really pretty active. I mean, they just elected a new head of the FOP who's the most disciplined officer in CPD history and still has hate speech up on his Facebook, his personal Facebook, just chilling. He's on desk duty because he's currently under investigation. And that's who they decided to elect as their president and their representative. And I think, we have to start discrediting these groups in the eyes of the public. They cannot be seen as some sort of, they cannot be seen as some nice, happy union that union people should support. And they cannot be seen as good public servants just trying to do the right thing. That is not, whatever you think about police officers on the ground, that is not what these unions are, by and large. And so I think that truth telling about that, and yeah, read your police union contract. I promise you will get fired up and angry once you do.
And I'll just add, they are very important political players in this space. That's one of the groups where we're looking into their contributions, and they make a lot of independent expenditures. They care a lot about prosecutor elections, and they are not even a little bit shy about going after the candidates that they think won't play ball with them.
I want to ask one more question kind of from the audience. So, and I'll start with you, Stephanie, because it's kind of related to COVID-19. And so the exact question is, how can progressive prosecutors kind of lead around this effort? So COVID-19 and kind of decarceration.
So one thing is, prosecutors need to take a non-traditional approach. One of the first things that happened, and my dog is like drinking water really loudly right now, so if you hear some noise, that's what it is. So one of the things that happened, like when COVID-19 first hit in March, our public defender hit me up and said, this is going to go nuts if it gets in the jails. And I was like, oh snap, you're 100% correct. Let's join up and make some motions. And so I told all my attorneys, hey, look, we're not going to sit there and say we submitted to the court or we don't object. We are going to have joint motions with the public defenders every day to get as many people out who are, not a serious threat to the community as we can. And oh, by the way, why are they locked up in the first place, y'all? What's going on? Let's talk. So that was one thing that was a rude awakening. Right away was okay, let's go and get these people out. But also, hey, wait a minute, we talk about this every day. Why are they in there? And then having these conversations around their actions versus what is the court doing and all these different conversations. But also, we did it with everybody that we possibly could. And then that was kind of it. And then we got stuck because of all the judicial emergency orders where we were just not having proceedings. And so if there's this thought process, I see the question says decrease the case backlog because of COVID-19. This created an entirely new backlog where now also we still are prohibited from having jury trials. And I'm not going to say that's the wrong call because, it's a safety measure, but at the same time, I've also told my attorneys, hey, plea bargains are frowned upon, but I'm like, hey, look, call defense attorneys. Do not pressure anybody. Do not give anybody an unfair offer, but see what you can resolve to get these people out. See about time served, see if people want offers, or we need to look at the elements of the case to see if they're actually met. We need to do what we can. And the judges were okay, if you all have agreements, we will hear them even when they were only hearing arraignments and bail hearings. So we have an entirely new backlog, and we probably won't be having jury trials for the foreseeable future. And there are people who want a jury trial, and that we're not gonna, nobody's gonna force them to do something that they don't want to do. So we, the thought process that we can clear up backlog, That's not correct. We have a new backlog, but we did spend time trying to get everybody out who we possibly could. And there were those rare instances where, like, if it's a murder case, we're gonna disagree. We're gonna object. So we had a few where we objected, but for the most part, we came to the court as a united front. Hey, we want to get these people out. And I think we maybe had like one instance where the court held somebody on their own. So there are, I think at the very least, prosecutors need to be doing that. Like, again, even if somebody is the accused, they are still a member of your community, and you are a public servant who represents everybody. So that was what we could do. But the reality that we still have backlogs and have even greater backlogs is upon us.
Yeah, this was my whole job as an outside organizer and analyst for all of COVID. So that was fun. We did some of those agreed motions. I think that probably for Kim Foxx's office, it was a learning experience on how deep some of the problems in the office go, because a lot of the agreements that were made at the top levels to get hundreds of people out of the jail were not followed by line prosecutors. And in the end, the number of opposed motions was actually extremely high, was a number that I know doesn't reflect her values at all. And that's, I hope that's a growing edge, because it really made that problem very stark. As I sort of move forward in trying to give advice, which is a lot of what Appleseed does, of sort of what's the best thing to target as we move forward, the things that I'm pushing is, okay, we did a bunch of release agreed orders. We need to do a set of dismissals and time serves, right? We need to go back through everyone's cases and say, because most of our focus so far has been on the custodial population. But when the cases start up again, there's going to be everybody else who's been out on bond who also needs their cases resolved. And at least for us, we know that there are a set of cases that nearly always go to probation, right? And there's going to need to be that kind of review and probably some mass offers to a certain extent, at least in a place as big as Chicago. I can't think of any other way we're going to do it. We have 20,000 cases, right? So there's, so that's going to need to happen. There's going to need to be a wave of time served. And I think there's going to need to be a wave of dismissals. I mean, I think that there's any case, Kim Foxx has agreed not to prosecute a number of cases during COVID. She does not control the filing of narcotics cases for a variety of reasons that we're trying to change. I think she's going to need, and I will be calling on her to do the dismissals of the cases that she said, if she's not going to prosecute them, but they've gone through to like the first stage anyway, we need to start seeing those dismissals to get the numbers down, or else we're screwed. I think the problem is that the coordination between the court actors is so hard. I think that everybody did the absolute best they could. And the results, we avoided in Cook County an absolute catastrophe. I mean, we avoided projections that would have had hundreds of deaths in the jail, but we lost 7 people. 1 in 6 cases in Cook County is traceable back to the jail. We don't even know, but we think that accounts for a huge amount of our racial disparity, is just the racial disparity in the jail, going back and getting it that way. And, and it's not over. And so, it's going to have to be hopefully the second time around, as we start to look at case backlogs, we can do it better. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to need to do.
Thank you so much. I want to just thank this panel. I want to thank Ms. Rogers, who joined us for the first hour for this discussion. So this panel and the other 2 that were from yesterday will be recorded. They are being recorded, so they will be available on our website, hopefully the next few days. I do want to put in a quick plug for 2 other programs that we have coming up in the near future. So one's going to be on Tuesday, July 14th. It's going to be focusing on race and pretrial practices. So it's going to be 4 p.m. Eastern time. So definitely feel free to join us, and you can find that information on NACDL's website and search racial disparities. Also coming up in August, and so it feels like forever away, but coming up in August, we would normally have an in-person kind of state criminal justice focused conference. Obviously, we are adjusting to the time, so it's going to be live and live but virtual and free. So we are adjusting our normal annual State Criminal Justice Network Conference. It's going to be August 17th through 19th, 1 to 5 p.m. on those days Eastern time. And so definitely, again, visit our website. You can search State Criminal Justice Network to register for that free conference. So thank you again for everyone for joining. Thank you for the panelists for a great discussion. I really appreciate it.